Disclaimer: this video is not a tutorial. Movement is hard. Or perhaps I should specify that learning how to program movement in a 3D game is hard. That may surprise you even if you've made a game or two for a few reasons. I mean, at first glance, moving in a video game is as simple as just pushing a button or tilting a stick in the direction you want to go. But it's easy to take this for granted when one doesn't actually know what makes that concept work. To be fair, engines like Unreal or Unity typically have built-in player controllers with adjustable settings. But this isn't the case for me because, quite frankly, Godot is just a much better option. After all, it's open source and, more importantly, it's completely free, although it does come with some caveats. The biggest one being that what you're going to feature in your game you're gonna have to make yourself from scratch, and this applies to a movable 3D character. I'm sure there are player controllers out there for Godot, but considering that means using somebody else's code, you're unlikely to have full control over using it effectively unless you learn how it works. That said, if you're going to take the time to learn somebody else's code, you might as well just make the movement code yourself. It'll be easier for you to understand your own code over someone else's. That's not going to make actually programming it any easier though. If you've ever made a 2D game in Godot before, especially a side-scroller of some sort, then you'd probably think 3D movement isn't much different. Sure enough, it isn't, outside of having a third axis. That is, unless you don't have a fixed camera. While translation in a 3D space is a pretty easy concept to grasp, it becomes less so when you also talk about rotations. For this video, I'm going to be showcasing the 8-directional movement code for a remake of an FPS game I'm working on in the Godot engine. This game will be fully revealed in a future video. Hopefully. The final result of this code isn't impossible to wrap your head around, but believe me when I say that I went down some serious rabbit holes to get to that point. Rabbit holes about concepts that will turn your brain inside out and give you multiple headaches when trying to understand them. We're getting ahead of ourselves though. Laying down the basics, in order to move in a video game, you have to change the player's velocity. You need two things for velocity: speed and a direction. Speed is the easier of the two since it can be something as simple as just a number. Like just any number. It can be 1, 2, 300, doesn't matter. As long as it is a number, it can be used for the player's speed. The farther away from 0 that number is, the faster the player will go. Pretty simple. If our game was in a fixed perspective, this would be as far as our game would have to go, since direction could just be defined as how much speed, whether it be positive or negative, the player has on the various axes. Those being the x-axis, the y-axis, and in a 3D game, the z-axis as well. If you're studious though, you'll recognize that means the player's actual rotation will never affect the direction they go in. Up will always equal up, left will always equal left, so on and so forth. This is problematic. Problematic? What was I writing? This is problematic if you're making something like a first-person shooter or a racing game or a 3D platformer or all kinds of games really, since in those instances, up needs to be the direction they're facing and not just up. So to fix that, we're going to have to tell the game where each direction should be pointing in. Direction, unlike speed, is a bit more tricky to understand. Because we're basically just talking to a computer, we need to describe what direction is mathematically, and we can do so using vectors. A vector is just anything that has
both direction and magnitude. Oh yeah!
We can describe a vector mathematically as a coordinate pair, or trio in 3D. Each coordinate represents a position on its corresponding axis in the game world, which we can treat like a coordinate plane, or cube in 3D. To illustrate this, let's look at this graph. We'll put a point at the origin, that is 0, 0. If we put a point at 0, 1, which we'll call an endpoint, and connected the two together, we'll end up with a line segment that appears to go in the up direction. We can also make this line segment a ray, and it would still be pointing in that direction. This is because we're basically just changing the endpoint's y-coordinate to infinity. Now let's erase that and put the endpoint at 1, 0. Suddenly, this line segment is now pointing to the right. Change it to -1, 0, it points left. Change it to 0, -1, and now it's facing downward. Starting to get the picture? Check this out. Let's plot two endpoints, one at 1, 0 and one at 0, 1, the right and up directions respectively. If we add the x-coordinates of the two endpoints, do the same with the y-coordinates, and then plot the result, we'll get a line segment that heads toward the upper right part of the graph. This leads us to an important conclusion. The addition of two vectors will equal their bisector. Bisector meaning that it splits the vectors down the middle. How does any of this apply to our game? Well, remember when I said that the player's direction and in turn velocity can be described as a vector? Of course you remembered that, you smarty pants you! What we need to do is first make variables for the player's speed and direction. The speed will be a number, for now, and the direction will be a vector, a 3D one in my case. Then we make the game check if the player is pressing a direction on their controller. If they press up, we set the direction variable to 0, 0, 1, the forward direction. If they press left, we set it to -1, 0, 0, the left direction, and so on. Fortunately, Godot has a way to make this simpler by having terms for each of these directions, like so. We do this not only for every cardinal direction, but also for any combination of directions. For example, if the player is pressing both down and right, we set the direction to 0, 0, -1 plus 1, 0, 0. Remember that adding two vectors will give you their bisector. If the player is pressing opposite directions, we just set the direction of that axis to be 0. It's not a very optimized way to do it, but it's versatile and straightforward enough. After that, we multiply the player's direction by their speed, which we can do thanks to the distributive property of multiplication, and apply that as the player's velocity. Most people will also probably tell you to normalize the player's direction or set its size to 1 before you do all this, but for me, doing so actually caused more problems than just keeping the direction its original magnitude. You should probably still do this, but if it makes your code break, then don't. Now for the rotation. Since this is a first-person game, the camera is going to be in the same position as the player, which saves us a little work. All we have to do is add some inputs for the player to rotate the camera left and right and have the game check if they're being pressed. If the player wants to rotate the camera left, then we decrease the player and camera's Y rotation. If they want to rotate it right, then we increase it. The speed at which we do so can be stored in a variable. We ain't done yet though. We may have defined what each direction is, but we still need to have those directions rotate with the player. Otherwise, we'll just end up in the same situation as the one pointed out earlier. We can do this by multiplying our direction by transform.basis. This little beauty is a 3x3 matrix that is used to help determine the transformations of objects in the game world. Okay, you probably don't know what that means. Think of it as a grid of numbers like this. They're not always 0, but we'll just pretend they are for simplicity's sake. Each row represents a different axis, while each column represents 3 types of transformations: rotation, scale, and skew. At first, the reason why they use skew instead of something like translation was beyond me, but a little legend by the name of Kays Emanuar recently shed light on a little tidbit that simply blew my mind. Turns out you can effectively rotate any object by skewing it in such a way that preserves its volume. I'm not saying this is actually the reason, but there is anecdotal evidence for it being as such. What does this have to do with changing our player's base directions? Well, everything, really. To demonstrate, let's put the Earth and Moon in a glass cube. Not literally! So here's the Earth and the Moon in a glass cube. The Earth represents the player. The cube represents the space the player is moving in, which is also represented by transform.basis. The Moon is just a game object we're using for visual comparison. You'll see that if we move the Earth, no matter its orientation, it will always be locked to the same axes. What changing transformation.basis does is transform the glass cube, or the space the player is in, thus changing the directions the player can go. I'm still not 100% sure this is correct, but it works, so I'm just gonna leave it at that. And before you ask, no, I didn't consult the Godot Discord server in any of this. This just came from hours and hours of research and a lot of trial and error. Congratulations, now we have functional 3D movement. But you may notice it's very janky. Let's fix that. The first way we can do so is by utilizing acceleration and deceleration curves. See, instead of having our speed just be a fixed number, we can instead increase it by a tiny bit every frame until we're going a certain speed. We make variables for acceleration, deceleration, and max speed. Then, whenever the player inputs a direction, we make the speed increase by acceleration every frame, unless it's greater than or equal to the maximum speed. If that's the case, then we cap it out at that max speed. If the player isn't inputting a direction, then we decrease the speed by deceleration every frame until it hits 0. Now, instead of the player going from a dead stop to 100% in an instant, the player instead smoothly accelerates up to that top speed, and vice versa. This doesn't just have to apply to our speed either. We can use this technique with several aspects of the player's movement, like the rotation of the camera, and even the turning speed of the player when they're strafing. This can be done by looking for the last direction the player was moving in, as well as the new direction the player is going to be moving in. The last direction can then be increased by a fraction of the new direction every frame until the player is moving in that new direction. Oh, and something notable about the camera, it doesn't decelerate. I mean, it can, but it's better off when it doesn't for a few reasons. 1, it means less programming, so yes please. 2, it allows the player to be more accurate and precise since the camera can turn on a dime. After all, most first-person shooters like Call of Duty and Halo do the same thing. This is about as far as I'm willing to go, as after that I'd have to deal with some high-level mathy stuff like quaternions, which use, get this, not 3 but 4 dimensions to describe 3D rotations, more accurately than Eulers, which are what vectors use to describe rotations. If you're wondering why I limited the camera rotation to only be along the y-axis, it's because including the other axes using vectors and Eulers would mess everything up due to a few limitations. Firstly, the axes of an Euler rotation have to be in a defined order, and sometimes that order can be wrong. Eulers can also get into a bad position called gimbal lock, which happens when 2 axes end up aligning with each other, rendering one axis completely useless. And with all this said, ladies and gentle goofs, I rest my case. Movement is hard, end of story. Really makes you appreciate games like Super Mario 64 when the devs had to make all this happen with far fewer resources. In fact, you know what? I'm gonna go play that game now. I haven't played it in a while. Like and subscribe, share with your friends, and as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Stay goofy out there.